So that's good. This is the aftermath of Pontiac's rebellion. Well, aftermath maybe isn't the correct word, because as these reforms are going in place, it's still happening. I think we made clear last time that Pontiac's rebellion lasted over a year. I mean, we're talking 14, 15 months from the spring 1763 attacks to where the British had to shift their resources and their soldiers into the West and to either bring relief to these forts that were under attack or fight Pontiac's allies for a sustained amount of time, and that was significant. So the gentleman that we're going to talk about today, who's featured a lot in the English attempts to bring about some reforms and more control over the colonies, is a man named George Grenville. Effectively, he becomes kind of prime minister. And there's a parade of officials in the 1760s and 70s in Great Britain. And there's a parade of them that includes a lot of turnover because some of them are very successful. William Pitt was very successful as a wartime minister, but he's voted out of office, and the king loses faith in his ability to, again, shift to some of the peacetime priorities. So the king, the new king, George III, brings in some of his own favorites, and he brings in Grenville, who had been basically in a treasurer role in the British, we might say the cabinet of the king's advisors, and then he made himself prime minister. So it's Grenville's reforms that are going to take place in 1763 and 1764. You know, the narrative out of the colonies in 1760, and this is the aftermath of the fighting, the attack and the successful capture of Montreal in 1760, kind of the significant and symbolic end of the fighting in North America, although we know that wasn't the case. Nevertheless, the narrative out of the American colonies, as far as the British soldiers and officers who were in North America, is that first of all, the Americans made pretty bad soldiers. And the Americans likewise thought the British war planners weren't very good and competent, made the war drag on longer than it had to. There was also an understanding among people in England and among the British officers who, again, were being sent back to England, and no doubt some of them were actually members of Parliament. So they served a dual role. You know, you had these upper echelon officers, the colonels and the generals, who had fought in North America. Some had been dismissed. You know, Amherst would go back and he would actually serve as a member of Parliament. So their news that they're giving people in England who never set foot in North America is that there's wealth in the American colonies, and the American colonies are, again, pretty undertaxed when it comes down to it. Smuggling was happening. We saw that widespread. We saw that happening during the conflict where the New England, New York colonies were trading with the enemy, and the policy planners in London and the soldiers and officers were thinking, why are they trading with the enemy? And the American response would be essentially, well, let's not let profits or the war get in the way of profits. So the other news, obviously, is that the colonists were moving west. One of the biggest transitions of population is after 1763. Thousands of people flood into the old French colony of Acadia, Nova Scotia, but Acadia as far as the French were concerned. People moving west along the road that the American militia and the British soldiers had built, Forbes Road, which goes out towards what? Fort Duquesne, now Fort Pitt. The Mohawk Valley in New York was transitioning from a lot of New England settlers moving into that area. So those are three of just a couple of them. They're going on the move into also now British Florida and other places across into what's now Western Virginia, the old Ohio country. So that's the first thing that Grenville had to deal with. There has to be, he realizes in 1763, even without Pontiac's rebellion, a distinct and very significant policy change or set of policies as he's going to go about. Now, these were thought of to be very rational, not the kind of policies that were going to annoy the colonists at all. In fact, if anything, Grenville had been criticized within members of the Parliament saying, this isn't enough. You know, there's a rallying cry that the American colonists should, as the phrase goes, pay their fair share. The English had used a lot of blood and treasure, as the expression goes, to secure North America for Great Britain, to remove the French, and now they're in the middle of an all-out Indian rebellion that lasts well into 1764 and even later. So one money-saving measure they think is going to be to curtail the gift-giving practices to Indians. We saw that completely backfired. And so they decide, okay, we're going to go back to that policy because it is a lot less cheaper than going to war. So trade goods going out to the West immediately reopens. And with that realization that the gift-giving practice that Amherst had shut down, the gift-giving practice has to be reinstated along with keeping soldiers, a permanent force in North America, probably along the lines of about 10,000 soldiers. That's what Grenville and others are hearing about. They also decided that they were going to shut down the movement of Americans into the West. It had to be done. Now, the first thing they did was tell the different governors in the colonies that you cannot give land grants out over the Appalachian Mountains. That's step one. This was going to be the beginning of the process, which is known, of course, as the Royal Proclamation. This comes as a real punch in the gut for not only folks who have participated in the war as veterans. They saw their victory against the French and French allied Indians as a way to open up the West. So people like George Washington heavily invested in the Ohio Company in Virginia. You were going to rent the land. You were going to sell it. And that was going to be a revenue stream. That was a revenue stream for the royal governors. And they were all of a sudden told that no, only grants of land of West will be monitored by people in London and given out that way. There's a conclusion in 1763. Grenville recognizes this. When the colonists and the Indians come in close contact, conflict happens. So again, the cause and effect is often lost here. There's an idea that Pontiac's rebellion happened and the advisors around the king said, oh, we're going to have to close the frontier. Folks, it was already in the works. There was already a plan from Grenville and the king's advisors to literally draw a line and keep the colonists on one side of it and the Indians in the new colony. The Indian Reserve is one of 4 new English colonies, including Canada and the 2 Floridas. So keep the English on the colonists on the eastern side of the mountains, keep the Indians on the other side. Again, they had fought to rid the French of North America. They're gone, essentially as a force. Okay, so what happens next? We want to prevent and ensure that there isn't a sustained conflict. This was going to be known as the Royal Proclamation. Let's pull that up and take a look at it. Not only how it looks on the map, but how it actually looked, because we have the actual document. There's George Grenville, by the way, complete with, what's that? A Royal Proclamation, here it is. George III, this is what it would have looked like as it was printed, and then it would have been reprinted in the American newspapers after a time. Here's how it looks in practice. Obviously, you can see the drastic change from 1754 to 1763 is that the French are gone from North America. The British colonies now extend, because of the peace treaty, the Treaty of Paris 1763, to the Mississippi River. The border between British North America and Spanish North America is the Mississippi River. But there you can also see the panel on the right is the actual proclamation line. Again, it's drawn literally from New England all the way down to Georgia and the border with the new colonies of the 2 Floridas. So the Great Lakes Basin to Florida would be reserved for the use of Indians. Whites were prohibited from settling beyond the Appalachian Ridge. If you were on the other side of it, you were forced to move to the east. Who was going to force you? Unclear. Probably the soldiers that were stationed in different parts of North America. Traders who were trading with Indians could only go west of the proclamation line if you had an official license from the royal governor. In other words, the only presence of anyone would be soldiers and commanders, forts in the western side of the line. And those forts were occupied by between 20 and 50, maybe a few more in the case of Fort Pitt or Fort Niagara or Fort Detroit, but most of the forts would have been occupied by a couple dozen soldiers at the most. And that would be really the British presence in the West. This is the Royal Proclamation. This is the beginning of a process to impose order on the colonies, although it didn't really work. The proclamation line does little to end movement of settlers to the area. Soldiers were essentially told to turn settlers back if you see them going out to the west. Okay, fine, you turn them back. Then what? Well, they go back a few months later. What if they build a cabin? You're told to, take out the cabin and tell the people you've got to leave. So it didn't work. It didn't work. Virginia residents, this is why it hurt individuals in the American colonies. Virginia residents had suffered greatly, as Pennsylvania and Maryland settlers had, because these were war-ravaged areas in 1763, and they wanted to go back. And hundreds did go back in spite of the proclamation. It thumbs their nose at the English authorities, and it dares the English to use the soldiers as kind of like a police force. You've got to be on the other side. Oh, yeah? And if not, well, we have orders to force you to go there, destroy your home and farm, and then they say, well, we'll just be back stronger the next year. And that's actually what happened. So Grenville's policy makes sense. I mean, Pontiac's rebellion had just proven the wisdom of it. They already were drawing it up. But what Pontiac's rebellion does is remind the English that our control of the West was tenuous. We could have lost it fairly easily if the Indians had been able to sustain their attacks and keep their sieges going and God forbid actually capture Fort Pitt or Fort Detroit in the West. So these innovations for the proclamation line was the first step, had everyone support the king, the ministry. There are 4 new colonies. The English wanted to, of course, cut the size of the British Army dramatically, but they really weren't going to be able to do that. Get the notes back up for everyone to see here. Okay. It goes back to that idea that, well, is this really kind of a conspiracy among the leadership and the people around the king? And no, it's anything but that. It's a really rational, methodical process. It makes sense. So can we reduce the number of soldiers? We'd like to do that. We'd like to reduce the size of the Army and Navy because there's peace now between France and Spain. We can, again, spend less money on expenditures by cutting the military, but they can't really do that because now they're going to have to keep a presence in the American colonies. There's a practical question, of course, for the king, who often calls himself the Patriot King. I mean, he's very closely tied to the military. He wants to believe he is an advocate. He has to, again, consider that if this is going to be the first step in reform, right, you're going to have to shut down the West and then raise some revenue because you have to keep your officers who you hope are loyal to the king on half pay. This was the process that was in a lot of parts of Europe. When there was no fighting, the officers would have half pay. Some of them would have like a pension, half pay for life. But you kept them paid off because you wanted them to remain loyal to the British government and specifically the king. That was going to be a somewhat expensive process. The other question, obviously, for the colonists was that stationing soldiers in North America is a dicey proposition. Well, the standing army idea. The Englishmen and colonists bristled at the idea. So what were you going to do? It's an important move by Parliament. By the way, there's little debate over this. The Royal Proclamation is announced by the king. And as far as people in England, again, Parliament is supposed to represent England and all of the colonies. No one stood up and said, no, I don't know if this is such a great idea. In fact, everyone really got behind it. There's little debate. There's little outcry. Makes sense.
Well, now, was there any representatives from the colonies, or was it people that were supposed to be the boys but never actually lived in the colonies.
Exactly. What do you think?
It was the last one.
Yeah, that's a great question. There are no American colonists in Parliament. No colonist sits in Parliament in 1763. The principle, as you alluded to, is called virtual representation. I may represent Wessex in England, but I also have the interest of all of the colonists. You know, it's kind of a leap of faith, right? That someone who never sets foot in Massachusetts, and trust me, they don't want to, leave England, can speak for folks on both sides of the Atlantic. But this is the principle. It's literally called virtual representation. We represent both sides. So yeah, they're supposed to have the interests of everyone in the empire in mind. And there was opposition to future acts of parliament. There were some people who were considered allies of the Americans, but you don't see it with the Proclamation, and you don't see it with what we're going to talk about, the Sugar Act today as well. Okay, so what do you do when you have these situation of new colonies? I mean, Canada is filled with Frenchmen of questionable loyalty who are now under the control of Great Britain. In the back country, you have the Indians who are important and valued for trade. The traders are certainly part of the story in the West. They could become, however, violent very quickly, usually when individual colonists swindle Indians out of land. Grenville recognizes that American colonists are really good at provoking Indians and starting wars. So that's step one. Close the frontier, keep the colonists on one side, Indians on the other. The Indian Reserve in the West, that's what the Proclamation of 1763 sets up. The next part, of course, and the challenge for Grenville is how to come up with some revenue within the colonies themselves. And this is a problem for him and those that we're going to talk about who follow Grenville. Because when they're successful, the king dismisses the prime minister. There's a new vote of government and parliament. And if, like the current prime minister, if he or she were to lose the faith of the English people and the English government, they would be voted out and a new party would come in. Again, the king's power was somewhat limited, had been in England for the last 70 or so years. They're important. They can, again, choose the people around them. But it is parliament. Yeah, the virtual representation. So that's interesting when we talk about the idea that no colonist sits in parliament. But there are people who represent the American colonies. They are colonial agents. What are they? Lobbyists. They're like modern day lobbyists. Ben Franklin in the 1760s is lobbying very much for his friends in Parliament to turn Pennsylvania from a colony controlled by the Penn family to a royal colony where the king appoints the governor. And who does he have in mind to be the first royal governor of Pennsylvania? Benjamin Franklin. So Franklin will go on to represent different colonies as he's so successful at it. He's a loyal British person. He has friends over there. This is his retirement. Remember, he's retired now in the 1760s because he's literally in his 60s at this point. And so that's as close as we get to the colonial influence in Parliament. So we have no colonists sitting in Parliament, and there is no colony-wide assembly, right? All the colonies have their own assemblies. This is what you should know about the American government. But an attempt to have all the colonists sit in one place, in one time, in one city, doesn't happen until the First Continental Congress in 1774. They had tried it. Now remember the Albany Congress. They had, 8 colonists show up, if that many? They talked about a colony-wide assembly, some kind of grand council, a mutual defense pact, because they knew there was an impending war with France, and the answer from all the colonies were, nah. I mean, jealousies, inter-rivalry between the colonies. That's what happens in 1763. When you have a mutual enemy, the French, right? You minimize your differences. Virginia and Maryland, well, where does our colony end? Where does your colony start? You put that to the side because your frontier is on fire. And then the war's over and you go back to the petty squabbling that takes place between the colonies. in Rhode Island, in Pennsylvania over wresting control of the colony from the Penn family and the descendants of the Penns to making it a royal colony. East and West rivalries in places like North Carolina. Multiple office holdings. We're going to find that play out in Massachusetts with the Hutchinson family. Okay, getting distracted as usual. That's okay, it's part of the story. That's a great question. The virtual representation idea. Democracy is not by our own standards, obviously, because there are large groups of the population who cannot vote. But we now think that a significant part of the American population, adult men, can vote. More than in England, a lot more. You have to own land. You have to own land to vote. Why? Because if you don't own land, why the hell would we give you the right to vote? You're not invested in the community. Those laws would change. But most people, even if you were, again, people worked in land, 90% of the people did. But if you were a shopkeeper, you also owned land. Technically, it might be a farm or the house or the land around your house. So that qualified you to vote. And it's a heck of a lot more people than in England. Also, they were very careful, more careful in the American colonies in making representation accurate. You know, when you created new counties in the West, you would carve out a new section. If the population was moving to, let's say, central North Carolina, you would divide counties and you would have representatives go to the assembly of that particular colony. In England, they had boroughs that like washed into the North Sea. You know, that, and then they still would send a representative from that village that had, you know, fallen into the ocean to Parliament. They were called the Rotten Boroughs. That was a nickname they had in England. So it was kind of a joke. That person still got a seat in Parliament, and who are you representing? Well, no one, but yeah, it would be called now reapportionment. That would be the modern day. You know, if people move from one state to another. If we have a population shift from Louisiana to Texas, we might lose representation in our state and another state might pick it up. They didn't really do that in England in the 18th century. So we had improved upon the democratic idea of representation being more accurate. Again, it's not democracy by our 2020 standards. Nevertheless, it's probably better than it was in England. And the idea that the colonies were governing themselves was a sense of pride, and we're going to run right up against the gray areas of what England could do and what they can't do. So let's get back to the revenue idea. The revenue idea has to do with the English debt. The debt of Great Britain is 122 pounds sterling. The symbol for it, I didn't put it in the notes, but it looks like a capital L if you've ever seen it, kind of a script L. 122 pounds sterling, not critical for you to know, but it had basically doubled during the French and Indian War. This is a significant amount. Even worse, the interest on the debt is 4 million pounds sterling per year. So kind of like the United States now, we're never possibly ever going to pay down our national debt, but we'd like to pay the interest on the debt. It gives creditors around the world the sense that the United States is still a good investment. England was suffering through their debt. People who were selling credit to the English government were kind of like, you know, we won't do it anymore if you can't at least make an effort to lower the debt or really service the debt. That's the term we use even to this day. Service the interest on the debt. This is going down a road of economic stuff that I can tell you I fully do not understand. So I'm just going to leave it at that. The debt is spiraling out of control, and you have to pay the interest on the debt, and that is Grenville's challenge. Just like in the American colonies, England is undergoing something of a post-war recession. They didn't use the name back then. They didn't have the term. They didn't even have the term depression. But maybe depression is a more accurate economic term. Let's think about this for a minute and why that situation might have happened. Pitt had decided, and with his colony first policy, to pour money into North America, right? It's like giving the royal governors blank checks, backed by the full faith and credit of the English government. You pay for the materials, you hire the wagon masters, everybody who is in the American colonies who's going to supply the militia and the army and the navy. It's great for them, but it's like a faucet when water is pouring out of it that's all of a sudden turned off. What do you do now? And so that economic retrenchment, war is good for economies, unfortunately. Good for a lot of people, Not good maybe for the soldiers, but when that stops, then you have a real situation on your hands. People are suffering, especially in places like Boston, from fairly high unemployment. Okay, that amount, that supply of money flowing into North America is done. And the colonies and the English on both sides of the Atlantic are suffering through that. The problem for Grenville, however, is that raising taxes in England is unthinkable. Everyone is taxed in England. They've estimated that you probably pay 22 or 3 pounds sterling in taxes in England and 1 in Massachusetts. There is no doubt about this. The American English colonies are probably some of the most undertaxed and no taxed, lack of taxes in the world. So squeezing more revenue from the English people, it can't be done in 1763. This is Grenville's challenge. Makes sense to tax the land, and if you tax the people that own the land, there's a lot of people that don't own land, so you got to find a way to tax them. Beer, candles, the essentials of life. The land tax is going to apply to the nobility. They're not going to like it. So the House of Lords aren't going to be thrilled with a tax or higher tax on land. Everything is taxed in England. Tobacco, I mentioned, beer, which are considered essentials of life by people, some people to this day. The gentry and the middle class might feel the pinch with paper and linen being taxed, which was taxed. Houses in England were taxed along with the windows in the dwelling. They're now grasping at straws. What are we going to tax next? Even if you want to escape the tax man in your carriage is taxed. So getting more taxes out of the English is kind of unthinkable. England, in other words, is running out of items that they can possibly tax. Their citizens are overburdened. The last time the English had tried to place a tax on the common people was a cider tax, which was going to apply to the apple growing districts in England. They had to send soldiers in to put down the tax protests in the apple districts of England. Apples were on churches. There was an effigy, which is a stuffed, like a scarecrow version. We're going to obviously talk about stuffed effigies of stamp collectors and customs officials. It's, you take clothes and you fill it with straw and you hang it up or whatever you do, or you put it on a pole somewhere. There was an effigy of a minister who wrote the bill to the cider tax, which was burned and then cheered by thousands of individuals. So getting more money for the English people was going to be more and more difficult. The situation in the colonies, as we know, was a whole other matter. Where did we start this discussion? The American colonists are economically successful, life is good, they're undertaxed, and they smuggle. They smuggle with great pride. Do in the American colonies? This is the report from troops stationed in North America when they begin coming home in 1762 and 1763. Grenville has no intention of raising money from the colonial trade to retire all of the English debt. He doesn't plan on paying off the English debt with revenue that he gets within the colonies. That's not his goal at all. His goal is to raise some of the money. He's not even asking the colonists to pay the total yearly bill for keeping troops on the continent. He's offsetting the price of keeping the soldiers in North America. How he's going to go about raising that revenue is another matter. The American defense was at the interest of the empire. All Englishmen would pay for it, including the colonists. So when you propose this idea to the people around the king and the parliament, they would say basically, hell yeah. I mean, why not? This absolutely makes sense. The early question is how to raise the revenue in the colonies. By what means do you go about getting money in North America? This centers more and more on trade, monitoring the colonial trade, the customs duties. That's where Grenville is going to start. As part of the war strategy, William Pitt, previous prime minister, had ordered colonial governors to begin to crack down on the practice of smuggling, those who traded with the enemy. Pitt called it, this is a quote that's in the notes and I'll read it. This is a reference to the trade with the enemy. Illegal and most pernicious trade carried on by the king's subjects, whereby the French colonies are, principally, if not alone, enabled to sustain and to protract this long and expensive war, unquote. English translation of all this, by smuggling, by trading with the enemy, the war lasted longer. Our so-called loyal English subjects weren't so loyal in that area. So there you have it. This is where you need to change and amend the lax policies of bringing in any kind of revenue. The previous monarchs of England, this goes back to the late 1600s, William and Mary in 1688 and 1689. They had, and other kings had followed throughout most of the 18th century, the 1700s, up to this point, followed a policy that was called salutary neglect, sometimes called benign neglect. Do we know that smuggling happens? Yes. Are we going to park the English Navy off the coast of North America to patrol for smuggling? No, we're not. Happy colonists are productive colonists. Why are we going to alienate them and make them mad? Their revenue helps sustain Great Britain. They are also the American colonists increasingly in the 1740s, 50s, and 60s. They are the consumers of British and European luxury goods. So much so that a lot of people, like in Virginia, are in perpetual debt because, like people who put a lot of things on a credit card and then just pay kind of the minimum amount, that's what the tobacco planters in Virginia and Maryland are doing. They're like, oh boy, what are we going to order this year with my tobacco crop that's exported? New clothing, furniture, linens, anything we can buy for our plantation homes, except that what we export never pays for that. But that's okay. The creditors in England and Scotland say, that's all right, we'll just mortgage next year's crop. And it's like paying the minimum and never paying the principal down when you have debt. You never get caught up. As far as the English are concerned, this is great. This is a great plan. We love it. The colonists would and Washington would go after the war and bemoan this. Of course, they created the situation. I mean, it's not that you have like medical bills and other emergencies that you have to sometimes do this. This is by buying these items and becoming consumers. Okay, so what are you going to do if you're Grenville? How are we going to crack down? Smuggling was extensive, and most Crown officials were on the take. That was the other thing. They looked the other way. Governors shrugged. One well-meaning royal official was someone we will talk about extensively over the next few weeks. His name was Thomas Hutchinson. He was the lieutenant governor of the colony of Massachusetts. We'll go back here. I think I have a slide of Thomas Hutchinson because, again, we will be talking about him quite often. All right, let's see if we can find Hutchinson. Here he is. Later will serve on as the actual acting governor when the regular governor is either out or dismissed. But Thomas Hutchinson, already in 1760, there are, I should say, enemies of Thomas Hutchinson because his family gets very important appointments within the colony. There is accusations, which are essentially true, of Hutchinson and his family members holding multiple jobs. He's also basically the Attorney General of the colony of Massachusetts. So Thomas Hutchinson, he decides that he, acting on Pitt's orders before the war even ends, is going to crack down on smuggling. Merchants, of course, tried to stop this, and it was Hutchinson who said, we can search private homes. Again, he's very active in looking for smugglers. Again, items that were brought in where there were no taxes paid on them. So the English government was losing the revenue on these things. So warehouses and private homes were searched. This got the attention of a lawyer who was working on behalf of the merchants. His name is James Otis Jr. And he creates a sensation over what are called the writs of assistance. That term is in the notes. Writs of assistance give the Crown officials the ability to go through warehouses and private homes looking for these items that were smuggled in around the watching eyes of the customs officials. James Otis takes the government of Massachusetts to court, fighting the legality of these writs. He says if they're allowed to search your private homes and other buildings, it's going to create what he calls a monster of oppression. The idea of an unreasonable search and seizure. Sound familiar? Oh, yeah. If you want to know why we chose to codify 10 of the Bill of Rights, you just have to remember the 1760s and the 1770s. I believe this is in the Fourth Amendment. If I'm wrong, I could be wrong, but anyway, or the Fifth, but I think it's the Fourth. Unreasonable search and seizures. This was carried out by anyone once London approved, and Massachusetts can now rally around the writs of assistance. Again, there were people in the colony that thought this absolutely makes sense, but it was Otis who fought the writs of assistance, and often he got, in this case, sympathy with very, we might say, merchant-oriented, merchant sympathizers in these juries. That's what puts Otis on the map as an early opponent of the Hutchinson family. And it gives them a cause in Massachusetts, the merchants, to rally around. Someone, of course, should have been in England taking careful notice of this development. Merchant-inspired mobs often prevent the writs of assistance from being carried out. Politics of the streets appeal to liberty. Apparently, liberty means breaking the law. I mean, and smuggling. No, it's your right as an Englishman to not pay taxes. So the mob had an outright willingness to protect the smugglers. Hutchinson would be forever tainted with his association over these writs. But the Board of Trade saw something here. Again, this is even before Grenville is going to put something in place to try to crack down on the smuggling. The Board of Trade, which is responsible for the commerce going back and forth from England to the American colonies, sees the fight over the writs of assistance and thinks, okay, they made a mental note of that. So it's going to be a factor in how we're going to change, put in new reforms after the Proclamation of 1763. So their first goal, the Board of Trade, and this is going to be carried out and voted on by Parliament, their first goal is to keep colony soldiers in the colonies. The second goal is to figure out a way to actually raise the revenue. Colonists have to pay for their own defense, and so it makes sense, and this is the connection going back to the time before the war ended, that why don't we raise revenue with commerce over trade? We always had the ability to do that. So we'll do that after 1764. It's a logical part of the relationship, the economic relationship between the parent country and the colonies. And no one in the colonies would have a legitimate objection to it, right? Maybe. Unfortunately, the people in England have no idea how the reforms are going to interact with the post-war conditions in the colonies. Remember, post-war recession/depression, 1763, 1764. And now into that situation, the English are going to ask for revenue. They're going to demand revenue and to have the colonists pay for part of the expense of keeping soldiers in the colonies and keeping them protected. That's going to lead us to a discussion of what's known as the American Duties Act. We know it, of course, as the Sugar Act, the first step. Okay, so this is the second set of notes that we've got. Here we go. And I'm sorry, I don't think it came up. So let's make sure we share it. Okay. Okay, there. That should be good for everyone watching. All right. The first attempt to get money by changing the revenue laws would raise, hopefully, he thinks, 100. There it is. The script looks like an L, but that's the pound sterling. British currency, a symbol for it. It would at least offset the price of keeping the soldiers in North America. Money would be raised by reducing, cutting, slashing. It's a part I always love talking about because who can object to a lower tax? I mean, you never have people marching through the streets bemoaning that taxes will be cut, like ever in world history. But when we get into the details of the American Duties Act, you'll see why simply cutting the tax is going to be controversial. The money would be raised. How would the money be raised? How do you raise money by cutting the tax? Well, you make sure the enforcement part happens. So this is what's going to take place. This is the American Duties Act. It would be raised on reducing the duty in half of foreign-produced molasses, specifically from the French. It was called the Sugar Act because molasses is a byproduct, of course, of the manufacture of sugar cane. Now, the idea that you're going to raise 100,000 pounds sterling is based on the fact that the enforcement would happen. Here's the rationale of Grenville and Company. Taxes high, nobody pays it. Taxes low, everyone pays it. Cut it in half, put the enforcement mechanisms in place, you've got yourself a steady stream of revenue. England had been, through Parliament, the representatives of the English people and technically the folks in the colonies, had been regulating trade for 100 years. It goes back to what were called the Navigation Acts of 1660. These colonies in 1660, many of them were in their infancy. There is no Carolina in 1660. There is no Pennsylvania in 1660. But there are colonies such as Massachusetts, others in New England, Virginia, Maryland. And what the Parliament was going to do in the Navigation Acts is basically control the trade. There are a couple of examples of Navigation Acts. One of them says that the goods that leave the American colonies can be transported only in English ships. Makes sense. Why would you let a Dutch ship take Virginia tobacco back to Europe? And the Virginians would say, because we get it the hell out of here before the tobacco rots and we lose our money. It gets infested with moisture and then the leaves all just disintegrate. But as far as the English were concerned in London, the Navigation Acts, what they would actually do is help kind of squeeze the Dutch out of trading with the North American colonies, because the Dutch annoyingly had created their own colony in between Virginia and Massachusetts, which they named New Netherland. Later it'll be called, of course, New York, when it was captured by the English. And up until 1763, the English had tried to manipulate these trade laws. It's kind of like the equivalent I always give when I talk about the Navigation Acts, is the idea that things were happening and the government has to keep up with the laws. It's like when we had the whole internet started. Yes, there was a day before the internet existed. We somehow managed, everybody. I mean, you're all like younger than me. If everything we went to the store to purchase things, not just online. But when online commerce started, the government in Washington, D.C., the national government, and in the states thought, well, as governments often do, how do we regulate it and maybe raise some revenue? Can we tax? Once upon a time, you paid no tax on things on the internet. And then they said, well, we can get money from taxing. And so now you do. So that's an example of things are changing in society and the government has to try to keep up. Privacy laws are another. I mean, can the government seize your personal phone and say, we need it either in because it'll help solve a crime? What are the privacy issues involved? All that has to be written and kept on the books. This is an example of that with the Navigation Acts. They're going to say things like in later Navigation Acts, well, items that are purchased by the colonists that come from either England or not from England have to go through an English port first. So Spanish wine, for example, that a lot of the colonists enjoy. French-produced silk or porcelain goes through an English port first and then to the American colonies. Why? You regulate it, you tax it that way. Makes sense. So this is an example of the English controlling trade laws for 100 years. So it makes sense when Grenville says we're going to revisit the old idea of stopping smuggling and bringing in some money. You know, Parliament passes a Hat Act. Parliament says, you and the colonies don't make hats. Why? Because if you make hats, you won't buy our hats. And that's what we always thought would happen between the parent country the mother country, the fatherland, whatever you want to call it, in this mercantilist idea, and the colonies. The colonies send the raw materials, you buy the stuff you used to know and love back in England, but no one makes there. Because you're just trying to scratch out an existence. You don't have time to make quality furniture or glass or paint or lead. They limited the amount of iron ore that the colonies can actually take out of the ground. So what I'm saying with all this is that there is a history, a 100-year history of England regulating trade. Okay, so why would anything else to raise revenue be at all controversial? Okay, the other part of this story, the flip side, is that, as I say this in the notes, collecting customs duties in America is not one of England's shining success stories. Smuggling started from the very beginning. Enforcement was not done, and the colonists found very creative ways to avoid the laws. And the laws are only good as long as they're enforced, and the English weren't great. From the passage of the Navigation Acts, then we have, I said, the period of salutary neglect, 1690 or so until 1763. I mean, it should have been a wake-up call when Hutchinson said, we're going to crack down on smugglers and enforce the customs laws. Again, the reaction was the nerve of this guy. I can't believe it. But he's following the orders of his bosses back in England. Grenville collected from the different agencies in the colonies, from customs officials, information about trade laws. He is going about this, I said, not in an arbitrary, let's just tax for the heck of it, the colonists on one particular item, but he's going around listening to the colonial agents, people like Franklin who are in England representing the colonies, and he's also talking to the customs agents. Now, the customs agents, believe it or not, who are in charge of getting the revenue, often don't have to live in the colonies. They send a deputy customs officer there for each particular city or colony because they're like, no way, no how I'm going to go over to there. I'll get scalped. I mean, that's the perception a lot of people in England have of the colonies. It's just a terrible backwater. I don't want to live there, so I'll send my nephew, who's a ne'er-do-well who can't even get a commission in the damn British Army. We'll send him over there as the deputy customs official for the colony of Rhode Island. And in short order, that deputy customs official in Rhode Island is bribed and paid off. So this is why I say it's not the best shining moment for the English. So it is one particular law on the books that Grenville thinks he can extract revenue. That is a 1733 Molasses Act that had been put in place in no small part because of the efforts of the English lobbyists on the sugar islands. Okay, this is the manufacture of sugar. It is a byproduct. When you cook the sugar down in the kettles, you produce molasses before you, of course, cook it down further and get what's called the raw sugar, and then it might be refined more in England. For the last 3 decades, the American colonists had flaunted the law. The Molasses Act put a tax on foreign sugar, specifically from the French and Dutch West Indies that came into the American colonies. That was the purpose of it, to raise revenue. I think it was 6 pence on a gallon or something like that. And it is Grenville who thinks we can actually cut it in half and still collect revenue. Americans have, they believe, good reason to explain their behavior of ignoring the Molasses Act. Or what they actually did was say, look, we'll pay the revenue agent a bribe that's still less than the tax. And they'll look the other way. The French and Dutch molasses will come in. What is molasses the basis for making? Rum. And rum distilleries all throughout New England. So it's a relationship that the American colonists think works pretty well. Distilleries need molasses. Molasses make rum, and a complicated exchange takes place. The British West Indies, and this is the other factor when we're talking about the Molasses Act. If the British West Indies could supply enough molasses, maybe this wouldn't be a problem. But they don't. The French stuff, as long as grapes exist in the world, the French look at rum and molasses, blech, it's just this byproduct of cooking sugar cane down. What in the world are we going to use it for? Wait, let me get this straight, the French say on these tiny islands in the Caribbean. The American colonists in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Connecticut want molasses? Okay. So we've got more of it. We don't value it particularly highly. And there's a constant demand for it. And in exchange, we will get from the American colonies, from places like Massachusetts and Connecticut, lumber. Why? Well, because we've cut all the trees down in the island, because we grow sugarcane down in the waterline, completely change the ecology and topography of these tiny islands. So we need lumber to, build houses and more sugar mills. We need barrel staves to store the molasses and the hogshead, as they're called, the large barrels that are sent back to New England. We need fish, salted dried fish, which is caught off the coast of New England. Pork, bacon, horses, all that. We can't feed ourselves anymore because, we grew the sugar cane everywhere. So that's an important factor. And so this is what Grenville goes after. Sugar is planted everywhere, so these islands have to import food. So here is Grenville's situation. If we reduce the tax, but make enforcement part of the lower tax, we will collect revenue. He told all customs officials, you can no longer send a deputy to North America. You will go to the American colonies to supervise the collection of the American Duties Act. Folks, there were a rash of resignations. No way, no how, sir, I'm not going over there. So you have to appoint other folks willing to do that. We might think that someone in England would have raised objections to the fact that a tax was passed on the colonists. After all, they have no representation in Parliament. But that's not the case at all. In fact, a lot of people thought this is all the revenue. You're thinking, what was the total we came up with? Maybe 100,000 pounds sterling a year. That's all you think you'll get, Grenville? Why not more? So the criticism, when we discussed the representation of colonists in Parliament, it doesn't exist. But the reaction is not, oh, this is going to cause controversy in the American colonies. The reaction was, we could probably do more, and we should do more. So the criticism wasn't of, oh, they're not going to like this. It was, well, can't we be more proactive in getting revenue out of the colonies? This is just a drop in the bucket. This is part of the expense of keeping the soldiers in North America. We could probably squeeze the colonists for more money. So no one stood up and said, there's not going to be happy about this. No one did, because everyone thought it was a good idea. The American Duties Act, known as the Sugar Act, passes with really no formal debate or fight. That's what it's called formally in 1764 when it's passed in Parliament. Cut to the essential terms, the Sugar Act did several things besides cut the duty on molasses in half. It also included important provisions because there wouldn't be a lot of money raised on sugar, but it would include enforcement. Ship captains had to take more care to prepare their inventory. On the notes, it's called a manifest. When you have an inventory of what's actually on your ship, if you try to forge your manifest, if you say there is, I don't see any French molasses on this ship, and there is, you're going to get in trouble. The ship captain will be held responsible for that. There were multiple goals of the new legislation: raise revenue and hurt the English rivals. Again, there wasn't going to be a tax on English sugar. The problem, as far as the colonists were concerned, is the English sugar was not abundant enough and it wasn't of the same quality. That's why they were forced, they said, to turn to the French and Dutch molasses. They also had a tax on Spanish wine known as Madeira. This is, if you're talking about a drink of the founding fathers, it's Madeira. Spanish wine is produced in Portugal as well. They're going to put a tax on that. It's produced in what are known as the Wine Islands. It had entered America duty-free. Until now, be a tax on that as well. Well, if they wanted to try to stop the trade, the illegal trade of molasses wasn't taxed, they were going to have that enforcement part. If you lower the tax, this is Grenville's rationale, you are going to collect the money because it will be enforced upon the colonists. The British meant business. They changed the customs service. So the enforcement part was going to be the other end of this talk. It didn't go well among the colonists because they began to articulate their protests in economic terms, for the most part. Again, we know the more vocal protests over taxations and no representation and all that. That really doesn't happen with the Sugar Act. It happens later with the Stamp Act. Prosecutions for anyone who violated or tried to smuggle in this would be shifted out of juries among the peers of people in Massachusetts, or we're using that as the example colony, because Massachusetts, it's expected is going to be pretty hard hit because of the Sugar Act. So in the past, if you were accused of violating the Molasses Act, you would be brought in front of a friendly jury of people who all thought smuggling was okay. And it was your right as an Englishman to smuggle and break the law. Now you would be brought in front of what's called a Vice Admiralty Court. The term is up there in the notes. No jury, just either a judge or a group of naval officers. The accused would then have to find himself in a court, not in Massachusetts or not in a jury in your respective colony, but in Halifax in Nova Scotia. You had to transport yourself at great cost to this Vice Admiralty Court to defend yourself. That's why this became controversial. You didn't use juries either. So most colonial juries we found in the past didn't prosecute smugglers. In fact, most people didn't really consider it a crime. They were doing a service to the people of that community or colony. So a crown official would decide your fate. The burden was essentially guilty until proven innocent. So you're dragged in front of this court, in front of a judge, or probably a pretty annoyed naval officer who looks at you and says, well, we've got this guy. He tried to sneak in French molasses without paying the customs duty, or he tried to bribe the customs official, and it's basically upon you. It's not innocent until proven guilty. It's guilty until proven innocent. So what makes the Sugar Act distressing for American colonists is the actual enforcement part. Because no one stands up and says, we hate lower taxes. No one in human history has ever really done that. What the Sugar Act does is give real teeth to colonial customs agents. It punishes bribe takers. It punishes people who attempt to pay bribes. Wrongly accused captains also could no longer sue royal officials. If you were brought in front of a jury prior to the American Duties Act, the Sugar Act, and accused of being a smuggler, and you, in your own defense, were proven not guilty, you can then sue the people who brought you to court for damages. Couldn't do that anymore. So you can see the enforcement part. I mean, people thought, oh, look, it wasn't the reaction of, oh, look, a lower tax on French molasses. This is great. They read it and they were like, ooh. If you read the details as a colonist of the Sugar Act, you understood that the British really, really meant business. More imperial regulations would follow. The next year, we have the onset of the Currency Act, also in 1764. Again, a brief background about that has to do with money and paper money in the colonies. Wartime measures, you print money, and most of the colonists were told that there's a certain equivalent of paper currency with the British pound sterling. Okay, in Virginia, it was basically $125 worth of Virginia currency was equal to 100 pounds sterling. And that was great if you were the possessor of the paper money, not as great if you held debt. If you held that debt and you were get paid, you would lose 25% of your value once those paper money was actually turned in. So the same year as the Sugar Act, Parliament passes the Currency Act of 1764. It forbids the printing of paper money in the colonies. So this is kind of a 1-2 punch as far as the colonists are concerned. Paper that was already in circulation all had to be retired, turned in for silver or gold. It was aimed specifically at Virginia because a lot of the colonists had determined that public debts could be paid with paper money and now private debts. So if you were a creditor in Virginia or more likely in England or Scotland, now the colonists had determined you could use this, a lot of people thought wasn't as valuable, paper currency to pay off private debts. And you can imagine that a lot of people who lobbied on behalf of creditors to the English Parliament said this is absolutely unacceptable. So this is why we get the result of the Currency Act. So when paper money depreciates, again, you're never getting, as a creditor, someone who lends money, the full amount back. You're losing. You're losing money. You're not getting the interest. You're not getting the principal even that the individual borrowed. That's why we have the Currency Act. What made it worse, the currency, under the Currency Act, the paper money couldn't be used to pay no longer. They changed it to public debts like taxes. So private debts, public debts, again, and stopped the printing of paper money. The reason that the colonists objected to it was over economic terms, much like the Sugar Act. The protests that come from the colonies are in economic terms. These policies, the Sugar Act, followed by the Currency Act, are coming at a time when we, the colonies, are struggling economically. So this is bad timing as far as the English are concerned. There's less food and provisions and orders from farmers and merchants because the soldiers are all, this is 1764, slowly as the end of Pontiac's rebellion in the West, there seems like light at the end of the tunnel there. That means that the soldiers are going to be, again, sent out of the American colonies and have that skeleton force kept there in the West. So again, this is why people were worried economically about what these two measures of Parliament would do. So how were these early economic protests phrased? By 1764, 9 of the colonial legislatures sent petitions to Parliament directly. The colonial, they go by different names. They're the House of Burgesses in Virginia, the Massachusetts General Court. Because the colonies were set up and created at different times, their governments have different names. In Pennsylvania, it's called simply the Assembly, Pennsylvania Assembly. But it's interesting, 9 of the 13 colonies sent petitions arguing that Parliament had abused its power. None of these, with a couple of exceptions, none of these colonial protests said that Parliament could raise revenue for taxes. No one conceded Parliament's right to tax for raising revenue. In other words, they weren't ready to surrender the idea that Parliament could reach in to the individual colonies to get money. In fact, 2 protests deny it outright, which is building a case for what's going to happen next year, the following year with the Stamp Act. New York, their assembly called it outright an innovation. So did the government of South Carolina. It's an encroachment that only the colony had, not Parliament. The problem in 1764 is there's a gray area between, all right, revenue measure with trade, revenue measure within the colony. This is that area where no one's sure Parliament's prerogatives end. You can regulate trade. They've been doing it for 100 years. But would there be an effort, because there were already rumors by people who were in the know that Parliament had held off putting in place as their first revenue measure a Stamp Act. They said, this is Grenville's policy, makes sense, right? Close the frontier with a proclamation. Raise revenue, some of the revenue, with a tax on trade. He didn't jump right after the war ended to a Stamp Act. The English people have been paying a tax on stamped paper for a long time. But he said, let's build to that. But some people were hearing whispers that there would be a stamp tax applied to the American colonies in 1765. Merchants in port towns began to organize, not in a violent way, but in a way to share their concern. to organize data. One of them was the Society for Encouraging Trade and Commerce in Massachusetts. What were they a modern equivalent of? Chamber of Commerce. Really people in different areas of the economy who were at this point trying to push upon England the idea of what the Sugar Act would do economically. It was going to hurt the American colonies, which were already hurting. So people were going to have a perception. That wasn't the reality, but the perception would be, and perception can be the reality. The Sugar Act and the Currency Act caused the recession. It didn't. The end of the war did that, but no one was believing it by 1764. At the very least, you believed it was prolonging the economic downturn in Massachusetts, where there were more people on poor rolls, there were more unemployment. This is a cost to the colonies. They have to find the revenue within the colony itself now to help out those who were economically destitute and really needy, widows, those who are hurt and injured and can't work. That all is part of this story. So these groups, like the Society for Encouraging Trade and Commerce, they were organizing in small towns, and they began to send petitions to the Massachusetts General Court. This is the government of the colony. Some of them were written by people like James Otis. One author was a man who had worked in the area of collecting taxes, and he wasn't really good at it, but he had to do it because his actual job that he had in the 1760s, he was busy running his family's brewery business into the ground. This is Samuel Adams. Once you're of legal age and you choose American beer manufactured, you might see this label on the Sam Adams beer. So ironic because the guy ruined his family's brewery business. He was a great agitator. He has here, and when he had this painting done of himself, he's pointing down to the Massachusetts Charter. Again, when you were painted, you chose what you wanted in the background, and he is obviously showing the importance of this legal document which has the existence of his home colony, Massachusetts, in mind. This is what one of the petitions that was sent to the Massachusetts General Court talked about. This is a quote from it, and we think Sam Adams probably authored a good portion of these words. But what still heightens our apprehensions is that these unexpected proceedings may be preparatory to new taxations upon us. For if our trade may be taxed, why not our lands? Why not the produce of our lands and everything we possess or make use of? This, we apprehend, annihilates our charter right to govern and tax ourselves. It strikes out at British privileges, which, as we have never forfeited them, we hold in common with our fellow subjects who are natives of Britain. Again, just stopping the quote for a minute. It's a theme that will really gain momentum the following year. The English wouldn't stand for this. In England, why should we? Let's go back to the quote. If taxes are laid upon us in any shape without our having a legal representation where they are laid, are we not reduced from the character of free subjects to the miserable state of tributary slaves? The slave metaphor, even by those who are very often slave owners themselves. This is the great unknown. Can Parliament govern both areas of trade to raise revenue and within the colony themselves? The way that the colonists responded in different ways in each colony didn't present one voice. I don't want you to think that this is a unified colonial resistance. And I want you to also understand that with few exceptions, the protest came in economic terms. Don't put this upon us now. It's going to hurt us. We already are hurting. This is going to make it worse. I mean, I know you heard the whole representation idea, but that is an outlier opinion from these group of different folks who were working as merchants and in other vocations. The American colonists are going to get a much clearer picture of what the English had in mind next, when the rumors about the tax on stamped paper actually turn out to be true. And that's where we're going to actually pick up the story next time. The institution of the stamp tax, the process by which it went through as far as getting information testing the waters to see if the Americans, how they would respond to a stamp tax. And then, of course, the completely unexpected reaction that happens in North America. That'll be the subject of our topic next time.